Good evening, and welcome to News of the World. It's Wednesday, August 5th. Tonight we drift slowly across 27 countries, from Libya to Ukraine. There's nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Settle in and let the world turn. Libya sits at the edge of the Sahara, a country where the desert has always pressed close against daily life. These days, that pressure is growing. Rainfall is less reliable. Temperatures climb higher than they used to. And for a country still finding its footing after years of political fracture, the climate is not a distant worry. It is something farmers feel in the soil and city dwellers feel in the heat of a long afternoon. The United Nations Development Program has been drawing attention to a gap that matters quietly but deeply. Libya needs financing to adapt, to shore up water systems, to protect fragile agricultural land, to prepare for the kind of weather that no longer surprises anyone. The money is scarce. The systems to attract it are still being built. What makes this story worth carrying tonight is not drama, it is persistence. A country working to stitch itself back together is also trying to face forward, to plan for a warmer, drier future while still managing the present. Climate finance, which can sound like a phrase from a conference hall, really means something simpler on the ground. It means a well that doesn't run dry, a harvest that holds, a road that doesn't wash away in the rare sudden rain. Libya's climate finance gap is still wide, but the fact that it is being named, measured, and discussed, that is something. If you're still with me, hold that thought. Somewhere in Libya, someone is counting what they have and what they'll need. And that quiet accounting has its own kind of hope. Sweden is a country that takes its pensions personally, not just as money set aside, but as a promise stretched across generations. So when the AP7 pension fund, one of the country's largest, raised its voice this week against a proposal in the United States to scrap a climate rule from the Biden era, it wasn't really about American politics. It was about what happens to people's savings when the world changes around them. AP7 is the default fund for Sweden's premium pension system, which means millions of ordinary workers, teachers, nurses, foresters, engineers have their retirement money sitting there, quietly compounding. The fund's managers have long argued that climate risk is financial risk. If companies aren't preparing for a transition away from fossil fuels, the thinking goes, they may not be worth holding on to. The Biden-era rule in question encouraged companies to consider climate factors in their disclosures. Now there's a push in the US to undo it. And AP7 has said, plainly, that it disagrees. There's no drama in the way they've said it, no grand declarations. Just a pension fund doing what pension funds in Sweden tend to do, reading the fine print, watching the long horizon, and writing a letter when something doesn't sit right. It's a small story, in a way. A fund in Stockholm pushing back on a rule change in Washington. But it's also a story about how far a country will reach to protect something as unglamorous and essential as a retirement that might still be 30 years away. And tonight, that feels worth holding on to. Paraguay, a landlocked country long known for its rivers and its vast soybean fields, has signed a nuclear energy cooperation agreement with the United States. The details are still emerging, but the broad shape of it is clear enough. Two governments have decided to sit down together and talk about what nuclear energy might mean for a country that has spent most of its modern story drawing power from water and from the land. There is something quietly significant about that. Not because anything is being built yet, and not because reactors are rising anywhere, but because a conversation like this begins with a kind of imagining. What could a small nation do with a technology that once belonged only to the largest? How do you weigh that against the rivers that already turn your turbines? Paraguay shares the Itaipu Dam with Brazil, one of the largest hydroelectric projects on the planet. And for decades, that immense wall of water has shaped what Paraguayans expect when they flip a switch. So this new agreement does not replace anything. It sits beside it, like a second door in a house that already has one. If you're still with me, you might wonder why this matters beyond Paraguay's borders. It matters because small countries are often the last to be invited into rooms where energy policy is discussed. Paraguay walked in on its own and signed its name. Whatever comes of it, that act of joining the conversation is itself worth noticing tonight. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines sits at the southern end of the Caribbean chain, a string of islands that has spent generations welcoming visitors by sea and, more recently, by air. This week the news reached the archipelago that Delta Airlines will end its flights connecting Atlanta to Saint Vincent with no plans to bring the route back. For an island nation where tourism threads quietly through daily life, the loss of a direct link to one of the world's busiest airports is not a small thing. It means fewer footsteps on the jet bridges at Argyle International Airport, fewer visitors stepping out into the warm Vincentian air without a stopover somewhere else first. The economy here, like many of its neighbors, leans on that steady flow of arrivals, on the guest houses and the fishing charters and the small restaurants that line the waterfront. When a major carrier steps away, the question that follows is always practical. Who fills the gap and how soon? There is no panic in the reporting, but there is a real concern, the kind that comes when a community has to rethink how it stays connected to the wider world. And yet Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has weathered bigger disruptions than this, from volcanic ash to hurricane season, and the instinct to adapt runs deep. Other routes remain. Other carriers still find their way to these islands, and the sea, as always, keeps its own schedule. If you're still with me, hold that thought. A small place weighing its options, steady and unhurried, the way it has always done. In Serbia, the great river is pulling back its curtain. The Danube, which winds through the country's north and has carried trade and memory for centuries, has dropped so low this season that vessels from the Second World War are reappearing along its bed. Hulls that were sunk decades ago, whether to obstruct passage or simply lost to the current, now sit exposed in the shallows, their rusted frames catching the late summer light. You can walk among them in places where, not long ago, there was only water. People have come to look. Some bring cameras. Some just stand at the edge and stare, the way you do when something you thought was buried turns out to have been resting just beneath the surface all along. It's a quiet kind of spectacle. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the river doing what rivers do when the rains don't come and the heat holds on. Europe has been living through a punishing stretch of drought and heat these past months, and the Danube is one of the places where that broad, abstract news becomes something you can touch. A ship that hasn't been seen in a human lifetime, suddenly there in the open air. There's grief in it too, if you think about what those vessels were part of. But standing at the riverbank in Serbia this week, what you feel most is the strangeness, the past, patient and unhurried, simply waiting for the water to step aside. Comoros sits out in the Indian Ocean between Madagascar and the coast of East Africa, a small nation of volcanic islands that most of the world has never visited. These days, there's a quiet conversation happening there about something still a few years away, the 2027 Indian Ocean Games. It's a regional sporting event that brings together island nations from across the Indian Ocean, and for Comoros, the question being asked is simple but meaningful. Can hosting, or even just participating more fully, change the way the wider world sees these islands? Tourism in Comoros has always been modest. The beaches are beautiful, the volcanoes dramatic, the culture a blend of African, Arab, and French influences carried across centuries of trade and migration. But the infrastructure is thin, and the islands have rarely had a moment that put them in front of an international audience. The Indian Ocean Games could be that moment, not because of spectacle, but because of what comes with it. Roads, lodging, visitors, attention. The kind of attention that lingers after the athletes go home. There's no guarantee, of course. Sporting events don't always deliver the transformation their hosts hope for. But in a place as overlooked as Comoros, even the possibility feels worth holding on to. And if you're still with me, you might picture it the way the people there do. A few years from now, warm air coming off the ocean, something new beginning on those old volcanic shores. Trinidad and Tobago has been hosting India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, and together the two countries have signed 8 agreements, a quiet but substantial widening of a friendship that stretches back generations. You see, the ties between India and this twin island nation run deep. Many Trinidadians trace their ancestry to India, to the laborers who arrived in the Caribbean in the 19th century, and that connection has endured through language, music, food, and family names. What these agreements represent, in a practical sense, is a renewed effort to build on that old bond, though the specifics of each one haven't been detailed in the reporting we have. What we do know is that Jaishankar's visit itself carried weight. Diplomacy at this level, between a nation of over 1 billion people and a Caribbean republic of just over 1 million, is a reminder that small places can hold large relationships. Trinidad and Tobago sits at a crossroads close to Venezuela, tied to the Atlantic trade, and increasingly vocal in global conversations about climate and energy. So when a visitor like this arrives, and when both sides leave with signed documents, it suggests a mutual recognition that the partnership still has room to grow. The agreements may cover trade, culture, technology, or shared research. We can't say for certain. But the gesture itself, the act of sitting down together and committing to 8 separate understandings, speaks to a relationship that neither side wants to leave to memory alone. And for a country that has long understood the power of being small but well-connected, that matters. Qatar has been quietly working the phones between Washington and Tehran, and this week, there are signs that something may be beginning to shift. Officials in Doha and their American counterparts are reporting progress toward a short-term deal. Not a final settlement, nothing signed, but movement where there had been silence. The talks center on 2 things: a ceasefire involving Iran and the possible reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow stretch of water through which 1/5 of the world's oil still flows. Qatar has long positioned itself as a mediator in the Gulf, small enough to be trusted by many sides, wealthy enough to be heard. And right now, what they are hearing from both the Americans and the Iranians seems less hostile than it has in some time. Direct talks between the two haven't formally begun yet, but the channels Qatar keeps open have been active, and the word people keep using is progress. No deal yet, officials are careful to say. No breakthrough. But the temperature, as they describe it, has come down. For a country that sits on the same body of water as Iran, with a population that lives within reach of the strait, this is not abstract diplomacy. It is the difference between calm and disruption on their own doorstep. So Qatar keeps at it, passing messages, testing possibilities, looking for the space where a short-term agreement might fit. If you're still with me, you might notice how often the world's quieter work happens in places like this, not in the spotlight, but in the long, patient hours in between. Nauru, the world's 3rd smallest country, has officially changed its name to the Republic of Nauru. It's a quiet correction, in a way, a small island in the South Pacific setting down a name that never quite fit and picking up the one it had all along. For nearly 60 years, the wider world has been saying it wrong. The name most of us knew. Nauru was a version shaped by colonial maps and outside ears. Nauru is closer to what the people who live there have always called home. If you're still with me, you might picture the place. 8 square miles of raised coral reef sitting alone in the deep Pacific, roughly halfway between Australia and Hawaii. Not much land at all, but enough for a people, a language, a parliament, and now, a name they recognize as their own. There's something else happening on the island worth carrying tonight. Nauru has begun offering what are sometimes called golden passports, citizenship for a price around $90,000, with visa-free access to more than 85 destinations. The money is meant to fund the country's fight against climate change. For a nation this small and this low-lying, the rising ocean isn't a distant worry. It's the sea that touches every shore, every day. So the island does what small places do. It adapts, it finds a way, and now, when it does so under a name that belongs to it. Hungary keeps its lights on with help from a single place, a nuclear plant called Pax, sitting beside the Danube in the middle of the country. It supplies roughly half the electricity Hungarians use, and it does that by drawing river water to cool its reactors. These days, that simple fact has become a worry. A heat wave has settled over much of Europe, and the Danube is running low enough that the plant is said to be down to its last working turbine, millimeters from a shutdown it was never built to expect. When you stand back from it, the scale is quietly staggering. A river that has carried trade and history for centuries is now too shallow to quietly do the work of keeping a country's power steady. Romania, just downstream, has been racing to divert what water it can, trying to keep the flow alive on both sides of the border. And in Hungary itself, there is a difficult conversation beginning about what sacrifice means when the energy system is stretched this thin and who ought to bear it. None of this is sudden. It is the slow pressure of a hotter, drier season pressing on infrastructure that was designed for another kind of summer. If you're still with me, picture that plant at night, lit up, humming, dependent on a river that is barely reaching. It is still running, but the margin it has left is not a comfortable one, and the people watching those water levels know it. Ghana has always been a country where the cocoa tree matters, not just as a crop, but as a way of life for millions of farming families across the country's green belt. So it caught people's attention this week when Ghana's parliament threw its weight behind a tough new bill aimed at protecting cocoa farmland from being converted to other uses. The legislation carries real teeth, up to 20 years in prison for anyone found repurposing cocoa land without authorization. That's a striking penalty, and it tells you something about how seriously lawmakers are taking the slow erosion of farmland that has fed the nation's economy for generations. The worry, as it's been framed in Accra, is that fertile cocoa acreage is quietly being lost to mining, real estate, and other development, sometimes parcel by parcel, sometimes faster than anyone quite realized. For a country that ranks among the world's top cocoa producers, that steady shrinkage isn't just an agricultural concern. It's a question of what the future holds for the communities tied to those farms. The bill still needs to move through the remaining stages of the legislative process, but the parliamentary backing sends a clear signal about priorities. And in the broader region, Ghana has also been quietly building its climate credentials, finalizing new methane guidelines for its oil and gas sector through the Environmental Protection Authority. Taken together, these moves suggest a country thinking carefully about what it wants to protect: the land beneath the cocoa trees, the air above the oil fields, and the long balance between growth and preservation that every nation has to negotiate in its own way. If you're still with me, that's the word from Ghana tonight. Palau is a small republic scattered across the Western Pacific. Fewer than 20,000 people living across an archipelago of more than 200 islands. What it lacks in size, it makes up for in the waters around it, some of the richest and most carefully protected ocean on the planet. Years ago, Palau made a decision that seemed almost radical for a country this small. It declared its entire territorial waters a sanctuary for sharks. No commercial shark fishing, no finning. The sharks that have moved through these reefs for millennia would be free to keep moving. It was a conservation measure, yes, but it was also a kind of bet that living sharks could be worth more to Palau than caught ones. That bet has paid off. Shark-related tourism now generates roughly 8% of Palau's entire gross domestic product. Divers travel from across the world to swim among reef sharks and pelagic species in places like the famous Blue Corner, and the income flows back into a country that has few other large industries. It is a quiet kind of success, not flashy, not loud, but deeply practical. A small nation looked at what it had, decided to protect it rather than spend it, and built something lasting from that choice. If you're still with me, you might sit with that image for a moment. Clear water, dark shapes gliding along a reef wall, and a country that chose to let them be. Rwanda has become something remarkable in the world of medicine, a country that flies small unmanned drones through its skies to carry blood, vaccines, and medical supplies to clinics that would otherwise wait hours or days for a delivery by road. It's one of the most ambitious uses of drone technology anywhere on the planet, and it has saved lives in places where a delayed transfusion can mean the difference between survival and loss. The terrain here is part of the story. Rwanda is called the land of 1,000 hills, and those hills make ground transport slow and uncertain, especially when rains come and the dirt roads soften. So the drones became a kind of sky bridge, connecting remote health posts to central pharmacies with remarkable speed. But the people who built this system are honest about its limits. Drones can carry what fits in a small box. They can't perform surgery. They can't sit with a patient through a long night and hold their hand. They can't train a nurse or comfort a family. The technology is extraordinary, and Rwanda has shown the world what it can do. But the harder work of healthcare still belongs to people, to the young Rwandans studying medicine, to the doctors organizing conferences on advanced care planning, to the clinicians who wait at the end of the drone's flight and put those delivered supplies to human use. The drone arrives, and then the real work begins. That's the part no machine can replace. Senegal has been running an experiment, not the kind that makes headlines right away, but the kind that changes a village slowly, from the soil up. The details are still emerging, but what's been reported is striking enough. More food on the table, more money in people's pockets, and less disease spreading through communities. They're calling it an eco-experiment, and the word surprising keeps coming up, which tells you something about how the world tends to underestimate what happens when people are given room to work with their own land rather than against it. Senegal sits on the westernmost edge of the African continent, where the Sahel meets the Atlantic, and the pressures there are familiar to anyone who follows that region. Thinning soils, uncertain rains, economies stretched tight. So when something goes right, when a project quietly delivers on more than one front at once, it's worth sitting with that for a moment, not as a miracle, not as a model to be copied wholesale somewhere else, just as proof that the connection between how people treat their environment and how well they live is not abstract. It shows up in harvests. It shows up in household budgets. It shows up in fewer children falling sick. If you're still with me, hold that thought. A country trying something and the something working. There's no grand announcement in it. No sweeping declaration, just the steady accumulation of better days, measured one meal, one harvest, one healthy season at a time. And that tonight is enough to carry forward from Senegal. Ecuador sits on the western shoulder of South America, a small country that has been thinking lately about where it stands in the wider world. This week, a member of the United States Congress named Maria Elvira Salazar sent a letter to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, urging that Ecuador be formally designated a major non-NATO ally. It's a title that sounds technical, and in many ways it is. It doesn't mean a military pact. It means a country is recognized as a close partner of the United States, eligible for certain defense cooperation and priority in trade that most nations never receive. For Ecuador, it would be a signal. A way of saying that a nation often overshadowed by larger neighbors belongs at a different table. The letter reflects a belief among some in Washington that Ecuador has earned that place through years of cooperation on security, on counter-narcotics, on keeping the Pacific corridor steady. There's no guarantee the designation will come. These things move slowly through bureaucracies, and sometimes they stall. But the asking itself matters. It's a gesture that says a relationship is worth naming out loud. And for people in Ecuador who have weathered a difficult stretch of violence and political strain, there is something steadying in the thought that someone far away is paying attention, not to the crisis, but to the partnership. If you're still with me, we'll let that settle and move on. Kiribati sits out in the Central Pacific, a scatter of low-lying atolls straddling the equator. And these days, the conversation there keeps returning to a question that touches almost every family: how migration might be made fairer for the people who call these islands home. It's a conversation that carries particular weight here, because Kiribati has long been spoken of as a place on the front edge of a changing climate, a nation where the sea feels closer every year and where the idea of leaving, even partially, even gradually, is not abstract. Researchers and policy thinkers writing from Australia's Development Policy Centre have been arguing that any fairer Pacific migration system, one that respects both dignity and destination, ought to start with Kiribati. Not because Kiribati is a problem to be solved, but because the choices made here, the frameworks built around how people move and on whose terms, could shape what's possible across the whole region. There's no single policy to point to tonight, no announcement to hold up. But there's a slow, serious reckoning underway, one that asks what it means to leave a place that may not be able to hold everyone indefinitely, and what it means for receiving countries to honor what's being given up. For a nation of just over 100,000 people, spread across one of the largest exclusive economic zones on Earth, that's an enormous question to sit with. And yet, sit with it is what people here are doing, patiently, thoughtfully, with the kind of attention that comes from knowing the stakes are not theoretical. If you're still with me, that's where Kiribati is tonight, holding a question about home and belonging, and what fairness looks like when the sea is rising. Finland has reported something it has never seen before: African swine fever, detected in wild boars. It's a first for the country, and for a nation whose forests stretch on for thousands of kilometers, that matters in a particular way. African swine fever is a viral disease that affects pigs and wild boars. It doesn't infect people, but it moves quietly through animal populations, and once it settles into a landscape, it can be stubbornly hard to dislodge. For Finland, which has long kept its domestic pig herds free of the disease, finding it in wild boars means a new kind of vigilance begins in the woods. Finland's forests are deep and widely shared, by hunters, by hikers, by the boars themselves. The animals roam across borders without paperwork, which is part of how diseases travel, and so the work ahead isn't dramatic. It's monitoring and testing and the slow, careful tracking of where infected animals have been found and where they might go next. For now, the report stands as a marker, a line crossed, a new chapter in the long relationship between a country and its wilderness. Finland has managed animal outbreaks before, with patience and with care, and there's no reason to think this one will be different in that respect. If you're still with me, just hold that image for a moment. The Finnish forest at dusk, quiet, watchful, doing what forests always do, adjusting slowly to something new. Czechia has been a steady home for many Ukrainians since the war began, and the question of how to hold that door open and on what terms has never been simple. This week, the country made a decision that will matter to a particular group of people. Ukrainian men of draft age who seek temporary protection in Czechia will now need to show proof that they have met what's being called their military obligation back home. Without that confirmation, the protection won't be extended. It's a policy that sits at the intersection of two pressures: Czechia's own careful management of who stays and under what conditions, and Ukraine's need to maintain its ranks as the war goes on. For the men it affects, the change is not abstract. It touches documents, deadlines, and the quiet worry of whether a paper from one country will be recognized by another. And for Czechia, it's a balancing act. The country has been generous in taking people in, and this move suggests it's also trying to coordinate with Ukraine's own wartime expectations rather than simply going its own way. If you're still with me, it's worth sitting with what a policy like this feels like from the inside. A man in his 20s or 30s, far from home, holding a folder of papers, trying to understand what a government now requires of him before it will let him rest. The night is quiet here. Somewhere in Czechia, someone is reading the new rules, and somewhere beyond that, someone else is deciding what to do next. DR Congo has been searching for a way forward after peace talks stalled, leaving the country at a difficult crossroads. The new humanitarian reports that attention is now turning to a national dialogue, a broad conversation that could bring together voices from across this vast nation. It's a place where questions of peace and governance have never been simple. The Congo stretches across the heart of Africa, enormous and rich in resources, but its people have endured decades of instability and conflict. When formal peace talks falter, the hope is that a wider dialogue might reach further, into communities, into regions, into the spaces where decisions made in distant rooms don't always reach. There's no guarantee it will work. National dialogues are slow, unwieldy things. They require patience and a willingness to listen that isn't always easy to find, but the alternative, silence, or worse, more violence, is something the country has lived with for too long. At the same time, DR Congo has been fighting an Ebola outbreak that has claimed more than 1,700 lives, now the second deadliest in history. Doctors Without Borders has urged immediate action as the outbreak spreads, and the World Health Organization says it has outpaced response capacity. New vaccine trials are launching, reaching out to high-risk contacts, and the WHO is accelerating its work. So the country carries two heavy burdens at once: a health crisis and a political one. And yet, the idea of a national dialogue suggests something worth holding on to, that people can still come together, still talk, still try to find a common path through the dark. If you're still with me, let that thought settle for a moment before we move on. Andorra sits high in the Pyrenees, tucked between France and Spain, a small country of valleys and mountain passes, fewer than 80,000 people. These days, its parliament has quietly amended the Labor Relations Act to increase union representation. The details are modest in the telling, but the direction matters. Workers in this principality will have a stronger collective voice, more room to organize, more standing in the conversations that shape their working lives, for a country whose economy leans heavily on tourism, retail, and banking sectors where the balance between employer and employee can tip easily. This is a meaningful adjustment. Not a revolution, a widening. Andorra has never been a place given to loud political drama. Its traditions of co-princes and parish councils stretch back centuries, and change tends to arrive the way mountain weather does, slowly, then all at once, then settled again. What this amendment says, simply, is that more people get a seat at the table when decisions about work are made. If you're still with me, picture a small government chamber in the capital, Andorra la Vella, where a vote like this passes without fanfare, but with real consequence for the people who clean the hotels, stock the shops, and keep the ski lifts running through winter. A quiet reform in a quiet country, doing what quiet reforms do, making the ordinary structures of fairness a little sturdier than they were before. In Zimbabwe, there's a story unfolding slowly, the kind that doesn't rush. The black rhino, an animal that for decades seemed to be slipping away from this part of the world, is making a comeback. National Geographic has been reporting on it, and the word they use is extraordinary. It's worth pausing on that word, because comebacks like this one don't happen by accident. They happen because people decide something matters enough to protect it, and then they keep at it through seasons, through setbacks, through years when the odds don't look good. The black rhino has been here a long time. It belongs to these landscapes, to the scrub and the thickets and the watercourses of Zimbabwe's lowveld, and for a long stretch, poaching and habitat loss pushed it dangerously close to the edge. Numbers fell. The future looked thin. But somewhere in that story, people dug in. Rangers, conservationists, local communities, they held a line. And now, the rhinos are returning. Not in great dramatic waves, but steadily, the way nature moves when you give it room. Each calf born is a small argument against giving up. Each one is proof that patience, backed by effort, can still turn a difficult story around. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment, a dark, heavy shape moving through the bush at dusk, unhurried, at home. Zimbabwe has been waiting a long time to see more of those, and now, quietly, it does. Micronesia sits within a vast stretch of the Pacific where health officials have been tracking a multi-country dengue outbreak this summer. It's the kind of story that doesn't make many headlines far away, but it matters enormously to the people living among these scattered islands. Dengue is a mosquito-borne illness that brings high fever, severe joint pain, and exhaustion. In small island communities where families live close together and medical resources can be limited, even a modest outbreak demands real attention. The World Health Organization and regional health authorities have been coordinating a response across several Pacific nations, sharing surveillance data and supporting local clinics. For Micronesia, with its 4 island states spread across an area of ocean roughly the size of the continental United States, the logistics alone are formidable. A case on one atoll doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening on another. Health workers have been moving carefully between communities, monitoring where the illness appears and where it seems to be fading. Dengue outbreaks in the Pacific tend to follow a rhythm. They rise, they peak, and eventually they recede, carried along by rainfall patterns and mosquito populations that shift with the seasons. What people need most during these stretches is information: how to recognize the symptoms, when to seek care, how to reduce standing water where mosquitoes breed. If you're still with me, you might picture these islands not as dots on a map, but as homes. Places where neighbors check on one another when illness passes through, where a community's care for itself becomes its quietest strength. Vatican City is the smallest country in the world, and yet these days it is quietly rewriting the rules by which it governs itself. Pope Leo has signed into effect a new fundamental law for Vatican City State, the legal framework that defines how this tiny enclave on the west bank of the Tiber is administered, how its institutions function, and who holds responsibility for what. It is the kind of story that might sound dry from a distance, the way constitutional matters often do, but in a place where every square meter carries centuries of meaning, even a legal document has weight. The new law appears to open Vatican governance more fully to lay leaders, people who are not ordained but who bring professional expertise to the running of the state. That shift matters. It suggests a pope who wants the daily business of Vatican City to rest on competence and shared responsibility, not solely on the shoulders of the clergy. And it comes alongside other signs of the same temperament: public masses through August, a welcome for new Swiss Guard recruits, a prayer intention focused on evangelization in the city itself. Taken together, they paint a picture of a pontificate settling in, finding its rhythm, tending to both the structures and the spirit of the place. A fundamental law is not the sort of thing that makes headlines the way a speech or a journey might, but it is the ground everything else stands on. And in Vatican City, the ground has just shifted, gently, into something new. Jordan sits at the center of a region that rarely lets anyone rest, and these days the kingdom is feeling the weight of that geography more than usual. For decades, Jordan has been one of the United States' steadiest partners in the Middle East. Not loud about it, not showy, but dependable. That alliance has brought security, aid, and a certain standing in the world, but it has also brought complications, and the current tensions between Washington and Tehran are making those complications harder to ignore. The headline from the Wall Street Journal puts it plainly: Jordan is learning that its American alliance carries a price in the confrontation with Iran. What that price looks like on the ground, whether in the form of security pressures, diplomatic balancing, or the quiet strain on a small country caught between larger powers, the details remain for fuller reporting to tell. But the shape of the story is familiar to anyone who has watched this part of the world. A country tries to hold its friendship steady while the ground shifts underneath. Jordan has always practiced a careful kind of statecraft. It doesn't have the size of its neighbors or the wealth of the Gulf, so it has made its way through relationships, through patience, through knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. That skill is being tested now in ways that are not new exactly, but perhaps sharper than before. If you're still with me, hold that thought: a small country, an old alliance, and the slow reckoning of what loyalty costs when the region around you will not settle. It's not a story with a clean ending. It's a story still unfolding, the way most important ones do. Japan has been watching its currency slip, slowly and then not so slowly, for longer than anyone in Tokyo would like. The yen, the coin of daily life, of morning ramen and evening trains, had been losing its footing against the dollar, and when a currency drifts too far, it reaches into people's pockets in ways that are hard to ignore. Imports get more expensive, groceries quietly climb, so Japan stepped in, buying yen to push back against the tide, and this time the United States stood beside them. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, a man who spent years trading currencies before he came to government, said the U.S. would do whatever it takes to support Japan's effort. He framed it plainly that a steadier yen helps stabilize all of Asia, and a steady Asia matters to everyone. There's something worth pausing on in that. Currency markets can feel abstract, a place of numbers flickering on screens in distant rooms. But when two countries coordinate like this, it's usually because someone has decided that ordinary people shouldn't absorb the full shock of a drifting exchange rate alone. Japan has been here before, propping up the yen when it falls too fast, and it doesn't always ask for help. This time it got it, quietly, from across the Pacific. The yen won't be fixed in a day. These things never are. But for now, two governments are holding the line together, and that in itself is a kind of reassurance, the sort that doesn't make headlines so much as it makes the morning feel a little more settled. Djibouti sits at one of the busiest crossroads on Earth, where the Red Sea narrows and ships from every continent queue for passage. These days, it is also becoming a place where countries come not just for trade or military basing, but for something quieter, for partnership in research and technology. Italy's university's Minister Bernini visited recently, and the word being used for what she brought is science diplomacy. It is an old idea dressed in new clothes, nations building trust not through treaties alone, but through shared laboratories, shared data, shared problems. The Med-Or Foundation, an Italian nonprofit with ties to universities across the Mediterranean and beyond, is working with Djibouti on underwater infrastructure, the cables and systems that carry information along the seabed and connect this small country to the wider world. The minister stopped at Djibouti Telecom as well, which is the kind of visit that sounds routine but means something more in a country where connectivity is livelihood. For 15 years, an Italian unit called the Silverbacks operated here too, working on surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities alongside Djiboutian forces. They have now completed their final mission, so there is a transition underway, from a military presence towards something more civilian, more academic, more rooted in the idea that a country of roughly 1 million people, positioned between Africa and Arabia, deserves the same access to science and infrastructure as anyone else. If you're still with me, picture that coastline at dusk, the cables running silent beneath the water, and a small country choosing its friends carefully. Ukraine is watching the weather now, the way a country does when cold months have meant something more than discomfort. There's a warning from Ukrainian officials that Russian ballistic strikes may escalate as winter settles in, the same pattern that has torn at power grids and heating systems before, pressing ordinary life toward its hardest season. These days, the strikes aren't only ballistic. Long-range attacks have killed 9 people in recent exchanges, and drone warfare has reached into both countries, with 5 killed on each side. In Kherson, a video surfaced showing a drone descending on a vegetable seller, a person standing at a stall, doing the small work of feeding a neighborhood. Ukraine has called it a war crime. The image is hard to hold, and maybe you don't need me to describe it further. What stays is the disproportion, a human being at a market stall and a machine built for killing overhead. Meanwhile, UNICEF and aid organizations continue working with children and families trying to recover, trying to keep some rhythm of childhood intact amid air raid sirens and power outages. The demand for Patriot missile systems stretches from the Middle East to here, a reminder that Ukraine's sky is one part of a wider, strained architecture of defense. If you're still with me, you might sit with this one for a moment. Winter comes everywhere, but it doesn't come the same way to everyone. In Ukraine, it comes with a question whether the lights will hold, whether the warmth will last, whether a person can still stand at a stall and sell what they've grown. Tonight, that question is still open, and the people asking it are still here. And that's the world for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow holds, rest easy. The world will keep turning slowly while you sleep, and we'll take another quiet trip around it tomorrow night. Good night.